Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
the jury system works and we have to abide by it.
The Rittenhouse jury gave its verdict, finding the Antioch resident not guilty on all counts. But what kind of precedent does that set?
Because the desperate need of substitutes is there.
How bad is the educator shortage? Districts are canceling school.
What a fight over book censorship in Illinois could mean for educational freedom.
After the killing of a University of Chicago graduate, a look at student safety on college campuses.
It is a great day for Wisconsin, and it's a great day for Foxconn.
But a new book says the controversial southern Wisconsin Foxconn facility was a bad deal for residents.
One of Lake Michigan's most troubling invasive species spotted at a Northside beach. What do we know about quagga mussels?
It's important to remember the history of the neighborhood as well as where we're going.
And a toast to the 26th Street family that's added a twist of Chicago history to Mexican spirits for more than 40 years. But first, some of today's top stories. Wisconsin authorities say they have identified the alleged driver who killed 5 people in a Waukesha holiday parade yesterday. Officials say 39-year-old Darrell Brooks Jr. is the lone suspect and was taken into custody a short distance from the scene. He's accused of driving a red SUV at a high speed into a crowd of people celebrating the Waukesha Christmas parade, leaving 5 dead and 48 injured. The chief of police says this was not an act of domestic terrorism.
Prior to the incident, was involved in a domestic disturbance, which was just minutes prior, and the suspect left that scene just prior to our arrival to that domestic disturbance.
At least 18 children were hospitalized. 6 are still in critical condition. The 5 who died range in age from 52 to 81. Brooks is set to appear in court tomorrow on 5 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, among other charges. Chicago is nearing a major milestone in the fight against COVID-19. Mayor Lori Lightfoot is confident that vaccinations of Chicagoans will hit 77% of people ages 12 and up by Thanksgiving. Now, that's for both fully and partially vaccinated residents. But vaccination data shows that vax rates remain low in mostly black and brown zip codes around Chicago. Here's what the mayor had to say about that.
Nobody's taking a victory lap, and we are still seeing progress in some of those areas, particularly on the south side, where we've been very challenged. But we will continue to work with our partners on the ground there.
A massive year-end donation for the Obama Foundation. The foundation announces a $100 million donation by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. The gift will, in part, honor the late Congressman John Lewis by naming the Obama Presidential Center's plaza after the civil rights icon. The donation will also expand the scope of programming to reach emerging leaders. Up next, recapping the Kyle Rittenhouse murder trial with a look at the verdict's impact. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Protesters marched in Chicago and in cities around the country this weekend. This after a jury last Friday found Antioch resident Kyle Rittenhouse not guilty on all 5 charges. Rittenhouse's defense lawyer Mark Richards says he believes it was a clear-cut case of self-defense when Rittenhouse shot and killed 2 men and wounded another with an AR-15 rifle during unrest in Kenosha last summer.
He didn't want to kill anybody, and he was left with a terrible choice. And he exercised that choice, which was found to be lawful.
So what does the verdict say about self-defense, gun laws, and the threat of vigilantism in the U.S.? Joining us now with more are Dan McConkey, a professor at Northern Illinois University's College of Law. McConkey is also a former state and federal prosecutor. And Chicago defense attorney Tony Thedford, past president of the Illinois Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Welcome both of you back to Chicago Tonight. Dan McConkey, as a former prosecutor, your reaction to the verdict that the jury came back with on Friday?
It wasn't much of a surprise to me. The prosecution bears a heavy burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and here, the defense was able to present an effective self-defense, a plausible self-defense scenario based on pretty compelling testimony from the defendant himself and a lot of video footage.
And Tony Thedford, the jury did deliberate into day 4 on this case. Are you surprised at the acquittal and not at least perhaps one of the lesser charges that they could have considered?
Right. Thanks for having me again. And I do agree with the professor relative to this being an easy self-defense case, at least relative to the defense, because there was enough information there for the defendant to properly employ self-defense as a defense, and his testimony was crucial to securing that acquittal. I am surprised to some extent, only because I assumed that a jury that deliberated that long would come up with a compromise verdict. And I believe that as a compromise verdict, they would find one of the lesser charges. My belief from the beginning was that this would not be first degree because there was this element of self-defense. But I thought that the jury might find a compromise, not because a compromise was required here, but because I believe that the jury saw the weight of the decision that they were making. And having deliberated for that long, I assumed that they were wrestling to get to that conclusion. So I was shocked when all 5 counts he was found guilty of.
Certainly a case that had obviously national reverberations. Dan McConkey, what was the key evidence besides the testimony from Rittenhouse that made the case for self-defense in this trial?
I think the key evidence is the videotape footage. There's so much footage, drone footage of all the shootings of all 3 of the victims here, and it helped the defense to focus in on just those few moments before the shootings. For the prosecution to persuade the jury that Rittenhouse was the aggressor, which would defeat a self-defense claim, it requires the jury to think about the larger situation. But when you've got that video that's pretty clear that in the moments before there are people coming at Rittenhouse, Huber is hitting Rittenhouse over the head, Grosskreutz is approaching him with a pistol, it puts them right in the moment, and it made it easy for the defense to frame it as self-defense.
Although, Tony Thedford, one of the self-defense claims was that Rittenhouse was afraid his gun could be taken from him and used to kill him. Is that a slippery slope there?
I think absolutely. The defense was successful, and at trial they were successful in framing this from the moment of the exchange between Mr. Rittenhouse and the 2 deceased gentlemen, as well as the gentleman who was shot and fortunately survived. But one can frame this broader from the time this young man brought this gun into the state of Wisconsin, or obtained the gun before he went out there on the street to presumably protect what he believed was protecting property somehow. So again, I think that broadening the scope of this, who becomes the aggressor or what the intent was of Mr. Rittenhouse actually becomes muddled, and it becomes far more muddled than what was presented to the jury at trial. However, I am not arguing that the jury should have had more information. There are certain rules when we're talking about trial which disallow certain information to come in because we want to ensure that the defendant has a fair trial. And here the court made a decision to cut off that timeline in terms of what the jury was to receive to that point, frankly, of the exchange between the defendant and the deceased in this case, and as well as the other victim.
Certainly just appeared to be like a fog of war situation, or at least that's how the jury saw it. Dan McConkey, is there any difference in terms of self-defense standards in Illinois versus Wisconsin? AKA, would it have been the same case had it happened in Illinois?
I don't think the law in Illinois is in any important respect different from the law of Wisconsin when it comes to self-defense. I think the result, if this had all happened on our side of the border here, I think the result would have been the same.
Although, Tony Thedford, there are certain standards that have to be met. And what about open carry laws in Wisconsin? Might that have been different had it happened in Illinois because of the different gun laws here?
Well, there was an assumption that Mr. Rittenhouse was lawfully carrying that gun. That assumption was made by law enforcement. That assumption was made by those people who could have intervened earlier by simply asking questions of this young man walking up the street with such a dangerous weapon. But when you factor in the fog of war piece, when you factor in the abundance of activity that was happening out there that night. Again, these were protests, and there was a bunch of activity police were involved in. But ultimately, I think this comes down to the assumption that this young man who was white was somehow safe and justified in carrying his rifle at the time he was carrying it. And the same scrutiny would not have been paid to someone if this young man were a black man. It's simply my belief, and I think that's pretty obvious based on sort of the history of what happens in our country.
And Dan McConkey, I want to pick up on that issue of race. Do you agree here that race did play a role, and is there evidence to suggest that black men do not get the same or get a higher level of scrutiny typically than white men?
Yeah, I was just about to chime in anyways and just say I agree with Tony. I mean, of course, when you look at just one case, it's hard to isolate race and say that was the deciding factor. But you know, I know Tony works with a lot of cases, and I've worked with a lot of cases over my career, and I do think it's hard to imagine a young black man walking the streets that night with an AR-15, and the police are just almost treating him as one of their own. I can't imagine that, and I haven't seen that before.
Certainly.
So I think race is a factor here, and I think that's why a lot of people are upset about this verdict. On one level, you say, well, it's a white defendant who killed white victims. What does race have to do with it? But I think for people that live with the reality of an unequal justice system, it stings to see a result like this. It's a reminder that blacks and whites don't get the same level of justice.
Certainly a lot of questions as to the conduct of the law enforcement that night on the scene. Tony Thedford, are you worried about the precedent that this finding, that this verdict could set for people who decide that they want to be armed at protests in the future?
Well, one could argue that precedent was set in this country hundreds of years ago in terms of disparate treatment between a young man who is white, like Mr. Rittenhouse, and a potential different young man who was black. So that precedent has long been set in terms of the expectation that the treatment will be different. That, frankly, is the tragedy of this case. In terms of it setting precedent, in terms of vigilantism, in terms of people's belief that they can then carry a gun into a similar situation with impunity, if in fact tragedy occurs similar to what happened to Mr. Rittenhouse's case, I think there is a slippery slope. But I think that this has more to do with not the courts and the court's permission to allow a person to act in a manner that results in the deaths of others. I think that has more so to do with the expectations of the gun carrying population. And frankly, some belief perhaps that just because one may have the right to carry a gun, even in open carry states, that then allows behavior based on their own discretion to fire that gun, claiming self-defense, when in fact it could be argued that but for the presence of that gun in the first place, there would never have been a situation that would have resulted in this outcome.
A lot of questions still swirl around here, and people will be talking about this case for a long time. But we'll have to leave it there. Our thanks to Dan McConkey and Tony Thedford. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Piers, thank you. A lot of folks have days off on Thursday and maybe Friday too for the Thanksgiving holiday. At least one suburban school's staff and students got an extra few days this week off due to a staffing shortage. It's emblematic of a wider issue in what educators say is a substitute teacher shortage. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Yeah, Brandis, it wasn't originally on the school calendar, but Evanston-Skokie District 65 is out all this week. Parents were notified in a letter Friday that even with subs and central office staff pitching in, schools couldn't safely operate, especially with pandemic guidelines. This decision was made both in the interest of safety and the mental health of our team. Superintendent wrote in that letter, based on numbers received today, we do not have adequate staffing or sub coverage to provide the necessary care or to support high quality learning next week. We believe this is a result of educators and support staff needing to rest and focus on mental health and also to tend to their own families. This is a sign of what President of the Illinois Association of Regional Superintendents of Schools, Mark Kleisner, says is an educator shortage statewide in schools that are rural, suburban, and Chicago.
As one of my superintendents said, you know, Mark, I don't have enough teachers to fill classrooms, so I'm putting my paraprofessionals in the classrooms. And I don't have enough paraprofessionals to meet the needs of kids, so I'm putting substitutes in as paraprofessionals, which means I don't have enough substitutes, which means my administrative team is now substituting in classrooms.
Data from the Illinois State Board of Education shows more than 4,000 unfilled positions in schools statewide, including more than 1,700 teaching posts this year. If there were more teachers, Kleisner says, there would be less of a stress on subs. It's not a new issue, but he says it has been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Medical issues or fear or concern for one's own health, or even political alignments, lately, that's been a problem as well.
Another issue, pay. Kleisner says that on average, subs make about $100 a day. It is more in CPS, about $180. But given licensure and what's needed to do the job, Michelle Gunderson says that's not enough.
You can't treat substitutes as something on the back burner and then not realize that there's going to be a crisis along the line. It has to be something that's treated as a priority.
I talked to Gunderson this afternoon after she had substituted for a third grade class at the CPS school from which she'd retired.
Our biggest resource really is our retired teachers. We know the children, we know the district, we're qualified, we already have our licensure. But when I retired, I did not receive a letter, an invitation, please come sub for us, here's how you do it.
Gunderson, who is also a teachers union leader, says that the district should be working to remove every barrier to make it easier to staff up, and that includes proactively reaching out to retirees. Some efforts have been made on that front. Retired CPS teachers can now do that more often without getting their pensions nicked, and the district offers a $420 bonus each month to those who take on at least a dozen teaching assignments within a 30-day period. Now, that bonus is doing the trick, says Kathy Konopasek.
There were 500, 600, 700. I even saw 900 openings one time. That really made a difference because now I see on the system, the online system that we're supposed to use, I see that there has been a reduction in the need for subs.
Konopasek is a retired CPS principal who last year filled in 115 days for a teacher, and she too subbed again today. But she's in her 60s and has some COVID vulnerabilities. She says some would-be subs have fears going into the classroom, like health concerns.
So it was scary, and it is still to some degree. And there's much going on where our teachers are feeling burnt out. Our substitutes are feeling burnt out. I'm stopping subbing myself early in December. I'm not going to do the 12 days anymore. I appreciate the incentive, but I just can't. I can't keep up with it. I'm tired. I'm saddened by some of the things we see.
There's also the issue of some potential subs being reticent to pinch hit at schools. There's problematic situations, be it any potential violence or maybe a difficult principal.
A substitute teacher will look at that on the screen and will decide not to go there. Now, this becomes a racial issue too, and a problem with the tale of two cities that we have in our school system, because in our tougher to staff schools, we've had a fill rate that's much less than in our schools with white students in them.
CPS says it does not use teaching assistants to work as substitute teachers, and also that the district is making efforts, some of which Konopasek describes as valiant. For example, extra pay for those who take on assignments in those harder to staff or so-called incentive schools. Also, cadre subs who are sort of like permanent substitute teachers can now get health care. Kleisner, who's with that state regional superintendents association, says that at a conference this weekend, there was a lot of talk about how to alleviate this sub shortage.
A couple states in the country that have now allowed high school graduates who go through a training to be substitute teachers. And just frankly, in Illinois, we want to be really careful that we don't dilute the requirements to the point where we're eroding the level of quality.
It may not be as easy of a job as you might assume. Think back, he says, to when you were in school and to a difficult time that subs may have had, perhaps because you gave them a difficult time, hopefully not. But Kleisner does say that there are a lot of ideas on this front, including working to spread the word to those who are looking for a flexible and meaningful work, that you do not need a university teaching degree in order to work as a substitute teacher. Brenda, back to you.
All right, Amanda, thank you. Up next, after the killing of a University of Chicago graduate, a look at student safety on college campuses. Stay with us.
I come from a people that not only found a way to survive through the most horrific circumstances, but they thrived.
I could not save one of the boys of color in my own life. If my family could be exposed to this horror, then really it could happen to anyone. We are truly all in this together.
A discussion surrounding safety on college campuses is ongoing in Chicago, and more specifically, the University of Chicago community in Hyde Park is reeling from the November 9th killing of Xiaozhong Dennis Zhang, a recent graduate of the university from China. Some call for increased surveillance and security in the area, while others argue a greater police presence only exacerbates the root causes of gun violence. Joining us to discuss this topic is Grace Pai, Executive Director of the nonprofit Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. Pai is a Hyde Park resident and an alumna of the University of Chicago. Grace, welcome back to Chicago Tonight. First, what are your thoughts? What's your reaction to this call for an increased police presence on UChicago's campus?
You know, I truly believe that that will not solve the problem of gun violence. Hyde Park is one of the most policed neighborhoods in the city. It's under the jurisdiction of two different police forces, one of which is the private University of Chicago Police Department, which is not subject to the same kind of accountability and transparency as the Chicago Police Department. There are tons of police already in the neighborhood, and we know that that hasn't stopped issues like this from occurring. You know, it hasn't stopped gun violence from impacting our community. And so I think to try those same failed practices over and over again is not going to work this time.
So then if, added surveillance, more police, if that's not the answer, what changes could the campus make to be safer?
Well, we think this is a problem that is much larger than just the university, right? Certainly the university has contributed to pushing out communities of color from Hyde Park and surrounding areas, and has a lot of work to do to build trust and to build and to invest in those communities that it has contributed to making very exclusive, right? Hyde Park has become really unaffordable for a lot of people, and I think the university does play a significant role in that. But when I say it's a bigger problem than just the university, I mean that the city and the state need to take significant action as well. Gun violence results from decades of disinvestment, from lack of opportunity, from lack of access to good jobs, right? People are being traumatized. They're experiencing gun violence. Their family members are experiencing gun violence. And I think that the trauma of that cannot be understated. And so to reverse that, we really need large scale investments in things like gun violence prevention programs, in quality healthcare and mental health care, in all of the trauma-informed supports and care that people really need.
Can you sort of convey the sentiments and the obstacles that students from China might face when they're considering or when they're attending U.S. colleges?
Absolutely. You know, I completely empathize with the grief and the sorrow and the fear that many Asian international students are experiencing. You know, this is not the first Asian international student who has been killed in Hyde Park, and I understand just the trauma of what folks are going through. I live just 2 blocks from where Dennis Zhang was killed, and I can relate to that fear of going outside or going for a walk or not being sure what might happen to you. So I can completely empathize with that. But I think that we need to have an open dialogue with these international students, many of whom aren't really aware of the history of the United States, of the racialized tensions that exist in Chicago and also across the country. And I think this is a really important time for dialogue, that there is a lot that those students who are grieving have in common with other Southside community members who are Black, who have experienced the same kind of grief and loss.
Today, at a press conference earlier, you discussed the idea of Asian Americans being used as sort of a wedge to divide people in the past. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, so, Asian Americans have often been used to divide other communities of color. So, for example, the example that I shared earlier today was that of the model minority myth. This very common perception of Asian Americans as a minority that, quote unquote, does well, that doesn't need help, that's high achieving, highly educated. That myth was created by a white sociologist in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And it was created to uplift one minority and to kind of, work against another. That it's no accident that that happened during the Civil Rights Movement when Black communities were demanding equal rights. And that idea, right, that Asian Americans are just kind of innately gifted was used to play down the demands of the Black community. And also it's completely false. Asian Americans are not innately gifted. There's no certain cultural values that we hold that make us smart. It's just that the United States only allowed in highly educated and high earning immigrants from Asia. We had a very selective immigration policy. We still have a very selective immigration policy. And so I think that is the real reason why a lot of the Asian Americans that you see are highly educated or make lots of money or whatever the stereotype is. It's a direct result of our immigration policy.
Grace, have you been in touch with the university with, with regard to your organization's concerns?
We have not yet spoken directly with the university about these concerns, but they also didn't reach out to, community members really when making this decision. I mean, I think that it's telling that they immediately went to increasing policing and surveillance, which they know will negatively impact Black community members in Hyde Park and beyond.
Okay, and before we let you go, of course, the pandemic has been a difficult time for Asian and Asian American communities with hate crime attacks and rampant xenophobia on the rise. Have you found allies within other communities during this time, for example, within the Black community?
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of the work that we do as an organization is in solidarity with other communities of color. We've seen folks step up when our community has been targeted, and we try to also step up when other communities are being harmed, and that's why it's so important for us to do this racial solidarity work.
More work ahead. Grace Pye, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, controversy over book censorship in a school district in Illinois. We share the details. A new book says after bulldozing homes and spending big on infrastructure, Wisconsin's controversial Foxconn plant was ill-advised. An invasive species has docked at Chicago beaches for decades, and you probably never even knew it. We tell you about the Quagga Mussels. And a toast to the 26th Street family that's added a twist of Chicago history to Mexican spirits for over 40 years. I think you just saw the video of that. But first, some more of today's top stories. Additional police have reported their vaccination status to the city. Superintendent David Brown reports that as of today, 84% of Chicago Police Department employees, which includes sworn officers and civilian employees, have disclosed their vaccination status to the city's vaccination portal. Of the 84% reporting, nearly 79% are vaccinated, and 35 officers remain on no-pay status for refusing to enter their vaccination status into the city's portal. Here's what Police Superintendent David Brown had to say today.
We've made tremendous progress with educating our members. There was quite a bit of misinformation coming from various sources that we had to do a lot of counseling individually to overcome the misinformation about the impacts of not being in the portal on their employment.
Black City Council members suggest a compromise in drawing a new City Council ward map. With a deadline just 9 days away, the City Council's Black Caucus says it was willing to give up one majority African-American ward. They've been advocating to keep all existing 18 wards in spite of population losses in the last census. That concession means the Latino Caucus, which has been fighting to gain 2 wards, would pick up 1 ward in the once every 10-year scramble for power. Here's what the chairman of the Black Caucus said today.
We are supporting and have presented a plan for 17 African American wards, 14 Latino wards, 18 white wards, and 1 Asian ward that we feel is adequately represents all of Chicago at the same time while we are preserving the communities.
The Black Caucus did not draw 50 specific ward lines. Instead, their map shows regions where wards should be drawn. 41 city council members need to agree on a fully drawn map of 50 wards by December 1st. But a coalition of community activists introduced their own, quote, people's map today, and take a look at what they had to say.
Why the people's map? It's compact, it's contiguous, and it protects the communities and neighborhoods of Chicago. It is the way that people are empowered to have an effect in their own government. The people will choose the alderman rather than the alderman choose the people.
The People's Map includes 15 black majority wards and 14 Latino majority wards. Plus, it creates Chicago's first Asian American majority ward, and that would be around Chinatown. In order to force a voter referendum, the People's Map needs 10 alder people to back it, which they don't have just yet. Holiday travelers, beware. Thanksgiving travel numbers could return to near pre-pandemic levels. AAA says 90% of Thanksgiving travelers will take to the road in cars, so here are a few tips from the Motor Club. Leaving Wednesday afternoon is a bad idea with gridlock expected between noon and 8 p.m. The avoid at all costs route in Chicago Wednesday will be the Eisenhower Expressway westbound between Morgan Street and Wolf Road from 2:45 p.m. to 4:45 p.m. when traffic is expected to be triple the normal amount, according to AAA. The best time to head to Grandma's or wherever you're heading is after 9 p.m. Wednesday or before 11 a.m. Thursday. And consider yourself warned. There's an aquatic invader that's wreaked all kinds of havoc in the Great Lakes ecosystem for decades, and it's made a recent appearance at a beach on the city's north side. WTTW News reporter Patty Wetley joins us now with more details about Quagga Mussels. Quagga Mussels. Hey, Patty, so one of our WTTW News colleagues was stumbling across Edgewater Beach and found a Quagga Mussel. Remind us what Quagga Mussels are.
Well, they're actually this little guy. If you can see it, they're pretty tiny. And they are one of the most fierce, devastating creatures in the Great Lakes. You know, they're this invasive mussel that clogs all sorts of water intakes, sticks to boats, and is wreaking havoc with the ecosystem, especially in the food chain. You know, it's taking up all kinds of nutrients that small fish need, and then there aren't small fish for the big fish. They're a nightmare.
And how did they come ashore?
Yeah, so that was the interesting thing. It was like, here's this huge deposit of shells on this beach that our coworker says, you know, for 10 years I've walked this beach and I've never seen shells. And it's because, you know, Lake Michigan doesn't have the same tidal wave action as oceans do, so it doesn't bring shells up from the bottom normally. But we had some major wave action, some storms earlier this year, and that was enough to bring all of this shell debris onto the beach.
And that's one of many invasive species. How about the zebra mussels? How's their population right now?
You know, the quagga have pretty much decimated the zebra mussels. The zebras got here first. They're still, in a lot of ways, better known than the quagga, but the quagga have, like, completely taken over. Even the zebras don't stand a chance.
So I think for our viewers, the zebra mussel is on the left of your screen right now. But go ahead, Patty.
But they're both black and white striped, so that can be confusing if you're doing any beach combing and you come across the shells, because unbeknownst to me, quagga is a kind of zebra too that's extinct. So the quagga mussels are doing a lot better than the quagga zebras.
It's a powerful little mussel there. All right, Patty, thank you so much.
Thanks, Paris.
And you can read Patty's full story on our website, WTTW.com/news. And now to Brandis for a look at the fight over book censorship in Illinois. Brandis.
Paris, thank you. The national debate over book censorship is playing out in the Chicago suburbs. Parents and students in Downers Grove last week argued whether the graphic novel Gender Queer should be kept in school libraries. The memoir about the author's journey to coming out as non-binary has been criticized for having what some call explicit content. But supporters say it's not only affirming for students, but is protected by the First Amendment. Joining us now with more is Deborah Caldwell Stone, director of the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. Now, we invited groups that oppose this novel in schools, but representatives were either unavailable or did not respond. Deborah Caldwell Stone, thank you for joining us. First, what has been your reaction to this dispute?
Well, we're dismayed at any request to censor materials in school libraries. We firmly believe in the right of individuals, including young people, to make choices about what they read, and we trust the choices of the school librarians and what they add to their collection. I think that decision has been affirmed by the Downers Grove School Board and its administration that has looked at the book and affirmed that it met their criteria for inclusion in the school library.
So again, the book is called Gender Queer, a memoir. It's by Maya Kobabe. But are you aware of which parts the critics are calling inappropriate?
There are some panels that deal with sexual activity, and as a graphic novel, they portray that activity. And as always with graphic novels, it's a little more intense. It's a little more in your face because it is an image rather than text. But many, many books deal with the same kinds of activities and text and remain on the shelf of the libraries. It really is a question of what kind of information should be available for the library user. We're talking about a community of adolescents, young adults preparing for adulthood, who may well be dealing with issues about gender and sexual identity and have questions about it, whether for themselves, because friends are dealing with this issue, simply because they want to understand and develop empathy around the issue. Certainly, while we agree that a parent has a right to guide their own child's reading, they shouldn't be able to dictate what's available for the rest of the community, for other students who may want and need this information.
You mentioned that there are many books that portray, sexual activity and obviously heterosexual experiences. Do you think there's a double standard here?
Well, I think that we are seeing a campaign really to remove LGBTQ-themed materials from schools and public libraries across the country. We've been receiving multiple reports of censorship challenges, not only in Illinois, but in many other states. And the targets seem to be LGBTQ-themed books. Some of them are genderqueer. Others are books that you might think are innocuous, that are picture books that deal with families that are headed by same-sex couples. But over and over again, what we're hearing is anything dealing with gay, queer or transgender themes are inappropriate for young people, and there's an effort to remove those books across the country.
How do you think debates like this are being heard by students who might be considering identifying as a member of the LGBTQ community?
Well, certainly demands to remove these books from school libraries and public libraries have a stigmatizing effect. Certainly a message that you don't belong in this community, your books don't belong in this community, and that's really terrible. Libraries have long been working on being welcoming and inclusive institutions that reflect the lives and interests of everyone who lives in the community, not just some groups that are the loudest voices or represent a particular view. And certainly it sends a terrible message about civil liberties and our freedom to read. Public libraries and public school libraries are government agencies, and they're bound by the First Amendment. Students have First Amendment rights. Readers have First Amendment rights. And certainly we shouldn't be teaching lessons in censorship in this day and age. We should be celebrating our freedoms and celebrating the right to read.
Why do you think school board meetings have become sort of a battleground over, conversations around LGBTQ issues, but we've also heard it quite a bit with regard to critical race theory?
What we're observing is efforts by local groups and even national organizations to target school boards. I think the conversation in this moment is about what materials are available to young people. I think that's always been true about censorship, most recent, especially in the last 20 years or so. We very seldom see debates about materials that are available to adults, but when the materials are available to young people, we see many more disputes about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But ultimately, when we discuss these things, we have to resolve it in favor of individual choice, whether that's the guidance from the parent or the young person themselves, especially as they get older and they start preparing themselves for adulthood and life as a voter, life in society. To remove these materials from their hands is really a denial of their agency and their lives as individuals.
And Deborah, before we let you go, we know that, efforts to ban books is nothing new, but are you noticing more of it?
Absolutely. I've worked at ALA in this office for over 20 years dealing with censorship in libraries, and I've never seen this volume of challenges come in. It's what's led us to conclude that there is a kind of organized campaign using social media and certain groups to target these books at this time when there's such a conversation going on in this country around these issues.
Okay. Deborah Caldwell-Stone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brandis.
Up next, did Wisconsin officials make a mistake rolling out the red carpet for manufacturer Foxconn? More on that ahead. But first, a look at the weather.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight Podcast and subscribe.
The most jobs ever created by a new U.S.-based project funded by a foreign company. That was the splashy promise in 2017 when former President Donald Trump and former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker heralded a massive new factory in southern Wisconsin to be built by Taiwan-based electronics manufacturer Foxconn.
This is a great day for America. It is a great day for Wisconsin, and it's a great day for Foxconn. Today, we're announcing the single largest economic development project in the history of the state of Wisconsin and one of the largest in the history of this country.
But was that all a mirage? A new book argues those big promises have come up way short. The book is called Foxconn: Imaginary Jobs, Bulldozed Homes, and the Sacking of Local Government. And joining us now is the author of Foxconn, journalist Lawrence Tabak. Lawrence Tabak, thanks for joining us. Remind us who Foxconn is and what they had vowed to build in southeastern Wisconsin.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Foxconn is most famous for its construction of electronic devices, mostly in China, the iPhone being the most prominent of those objects. They, more lately in their history, got into the business of manufacturing large screen TVs, flat screens. And they proposed that they would bring that technology to the United States and to Wisconsin and build a $10 billion plant that would build the largest TV sets that you could imagine.
I remember at that time, the governor of Wisconsin had promised up to $3 billion in state tax incentives for creating all these jobs. They had promised thousands of jobs. Where is that project actually at today?
Well, the incentives that the state promised were protected in a sense by linkage to job creation. So that money has not been transferred. However, the local communities, Racine County and Mount Pleasant, village of 26,000, went in whole hog on the infrastructure spending, and they've spent at least $500 million on roads, water infrastructure, buying the property which they've deeded to Foxconn. And what's there is rather disappointing. About 5% of their promised square footage, and only a tiny fraction, maybe a few hundred jobs that have been created since that project was announced 4 years ago.
And a big cost here, you mentioned that those promised tax incentives haven't all been paid out, but a lot of money for infrastructure has, and so many folks lost their homes due to eminent domain, or they lost their neighbors. Tell us about some of the personal stories you heard about folks that were forced to give up their dwelling places.
This is really the most heartbreaking part of the story. First of all, that area, which I drove through in October of 2017, it's a beautiful area. I mean, it's a flat area with a lot of family farms growing not only cash crops, but produce. And scattered along those country roads were little homesteads, 1 to 5 acre homes, beautifully maintained and landscaped. And about 75 of those homes were given a letter in October of 2017 saying that they would be losing their homes through eminent domain. And the family farms that are in there have been also been transferred under a great deal of stress and perhaps even coercion to sell their land, even though some of it had been in families for generations.
And we remember that the former governor, the former president really touted this project as a massive investment. And as your book argues, it has not come to fruition. Was public input taken into consideration here when civic leaders were making these decisions?
The major decisions were done behind closed doors, and they were often top down. People that I spoke to, the most common metaphor that they used was getting hit by a train. This thing came into the local community with so much momentum and so much top-down power involved that it was just swept away. There were no hearings. There were no referendum. This was just dropped on the local community.
There were other governors of other states that soured on this deal, that kind of saw the writing on the wall. From your reporting, was this decision purely about politics more than it was the realities of economics?
Well, certainly it was politics over economics. Keep in mind that this was actually after Walker's attempt to get the nomination for the Republican candidate for presidency. And his approval ratings in Wisconsin at the time were quite low. He was looking at an election which was going to be challenging. And I'm sure he thought that this was going to be really the event that would put him over the top, that would restore his reputation. And he was determined to make this happen in Wisconsin, even though there were other states that were bidding plenty of money.
These bidding wars happen all the time. Chicago tried to bid for Amazon's headquarters, and you've written about some of these bidding wars in your book. What have you found when you analyze these situations?
This isn't a novel discovery for me. Academics have been pointing to this for decades, and that is that the net sum game of Ohio bidding against Illinois, bidding against Wisconsin is zero. If a factory is going to be built or if a headquarters is going to be located, it will get done regardless of how much incentive money is involved. It's just a case study here with Foxconn of how they played one state against another state to crank up the value of their project to the point where Wisconsin was willing to spend billions of dollars for the number of jobs that really would have never paid back that upfront expense.
And last question for you. Tell us what the future of that site is. Again, it's not going to materialize into what they promised, thousands of high-paying jobs or manufacturing jobs. So what is the likeliest outcome?
Well, first of all, Foxconn owns 1,000 acres of Wisconsin property. What they do with it is unknown. But they not only own property, but they have a pipeline to Lake Michigan water, one of the last great resources of clean water in the world. And the rest of the property, which is now about 3,900 acres, is basically an empty industrial park waiting for the civic leaders to potentially develop it over time.
All right, the cautionary tale just over the Illinois border in southeastern Wisconsin. And our thanks to author Lawrence Tabak. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, the new book is Foxconn, Imaginary Jobs, Bulldozed Homes, and the Sacking of Local Government. You can find an excerpt on our website. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Paris, thank you. Little Village is renowned for being a deeply Mexican-American community today. But that wasn't always the case. It was largely populated by Eastern Europeans until a wave of Mexican-American migration to Chicago in the 1960s gave it the Chicano flavor we know today. Among those migrants was the Moreno family, whose name has greeted thirsty visitors to their 26th Street liquor store for decades. Now the next generation of Morenos has another way for Chicagoans to enjoy a drink, and it comes with a twist of Prohibition-era history. Chicago Tonight's Erica Gunderson has the story.
When you think of 26th Street and you think of the different signs or understandings of what is 26th Street, people think of the Arch, and they think of Moreno's Liquors.
For more than 4 decades, seeing the Moreno name has been a sign that you're in Little Village. Mike Moreno Jr. is the 3rd generation of his family to set up shop in the community. His grandfather Jose owned 2 grocery stores in the neighborhood, and his father Mike Sr. opened the first Moreno's liquor store there in 1977.
People talk about gentrification and stuff, but when my family moved into Pilsen, it was primarily Yugoslavian, Czechoslovakian, a sprinkle of Polish, and so was Little Village. When I opened up on Harding in 1977, there was no Mexican liquor stores, and so we started bringing in all the Mexican product so that our community could enjoy that.
Naturally, that included Mexico's best-known spirit, tequila. Moreno's Liquors has become well known even outside of Little Village for its hand-curated selection of tequilas and mezcals.
Tequila has really become a global player when it comes to spirits. What you're currently seeing right here is actually the largest selection of tequilas in the entire country currently. So we have over 900 varieties of different tequilas that you could find. And people are looking for unique, they're looking for obscure, they're looking for products that have unique finishes.
And if you take a left at the craft beer section and look for the Neon Chihuahua, Moreno's Liquors also offers a portal into some boozy Chicago history.
This building right here was a bar in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but shut down due to Prohibition.
The blacked-out windows remain as a testament to its time not only as a speakeasy, but as an underground gambling den.
So they were gambling on the Hawthorne Racecourse over in Cicero. Who ran all the gambling rinks in Chicago, and who lived in Cicero? Al Capone. So although I can never prove that Al Capone was ever in this bar, I guarantee all the money here went back to Al Capone.
When the space behind Moreno's became available, Mike Jr. saw an opportunity to fill a niche in Little Village. In 2019, he opened a cocktail bar in the former speakeasy, named for his beloved dog, Osito.
There was a demand for something like this in this community for a while, but no one was providing that outlet. It's important to remember the history of the neighborhood as well as where we're going. So that's the whole premise of the bar itself, is a mix of that old world Chicago vibe, but with that modern Latin feel.
Under the leadership of bar manager Denise Soto, Osito's Tap offers a heavy pour of Mexican culture with a Midwestern twist.
I was raised and born in Mexico, and I love all the flavors, everything that I remember that my palate is craving. I always try to mimic as much as I can the flavors here and have a twist on cocktails based on that. So I was like, this is really cool. Like, I have no ending on how creative I can get. I can just showcase who I am and the city that I fall in love with, which is Chicago, and what I love to do.
Both junior and seniors say the Little Village community can expect to see the signs of their family holding down 26th Street for many years to come.
We were raised and grew up in this community, and we have a lot of passion and pride for that.
Because it's our community, and we just like to bring to the table what the table gives us.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
And if you're looking to learn more about your liquors, Moreno's and Ositos frequently hold tasting events, including a barrel-aged beer and whiskey showcase next week. You can visit our website for more information. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that is our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. You can also get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app, and please join us tomorrow night live at 7. As COVID-19 cases in Illinois rise, Naperville's mayor calls for an end to the state's mask mandate.
And a mentoring organization on the south side of Chicago is helping young black girls go to college. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and good evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm representing dozens of families in the crash of a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jet. Mr. Clifford is the lead counsel in litigation in federal court in Chicago.